This is Michael Popok, and by the looks of things, it's time for Legal AF After Dark. Donald Trump finally got someone somewhere to agree to post his $175 million bond required to stop the enforcement of the $465 million civil fraud judgment brought by the people of the state of New York. Who is this bonding company? Why is it run by a guy named Mr. Hanky? Where did he get his money from? And how come nobody's ever heard of the bonding company? And why didn't he go to like a regular traditional bonding company that requires cash in order to put up the bond? And what will Letitia James do next as she prepares her appellate papers? Can she go after any of Donald Trump's property now that he's posted the bond? And why did the clerk of the court reject the bond? Because it didn't meet their requirements. We break it all down one place. Got so excited I stuttered. It's on the MeidasTouch network on a show we call Legal AF. Take a listen. Let's talk about the New York Attorney General, the $465 million bond, and Donald Trump just making the deadline to post the reduced bond or undertaking that the Appellate Division First Department gave him, which is the $175 million undertaking. He finally found a bonding company, not one anybody ever heard of, at least in the bonding world, not one that's associated with an insurance company, which is usual, not one associated with a public company, which is also usual, but instead a little-known bonding company owned by the king of the subprime auto loans, Don Hanky, a $8 billion Forbes 20 listed rich person who apparently on his own say-so, without having to go through true underwriting, decided to bail out Donald Trump and give him a $175 million bond, which I'm sure there's a large fee that was paid for that. And one of the reasons I think that Don Hanky did this, Mr. Hanky's bond came into play through his company, Knight, is that I'm sure he was willing to take things other than cash. All other bonding companies, legitimate bonding companies, like the ones owned by Chubb Insurance or that are part of insurance companies or publicly traded companies, they hate real estate. They only want cash, dollar for dollar, especially if your IOUs are compromised by the fact that you operate or have been adjudged to have operated a fraudulent business, and your financial statements have also been adjudged to be fraudulent, and you've lost your chief financial officer because he's going to jail for fraud. And banks have fired you and insurance companies don't want to work with you any longer. It's hard to get a bond without putting up the dollar for dollar assets behind it. And so Chubb Insurance required, for instance, the $91 million to be posted behind the E. Jean Carroll bond that Donald Trump had to post. They required $91 million to be held. He basically signed over apparently his Charles Schwab account. Nice to know he has Capital One and Charles Schwab, just like everybody else. But he has $91 million in his, and he turned it over in a restricted account in favor of the bonding company in case he defaults. And that came out of his $400 or so million of cash that he admitted he had about a year ago, leaving him, let's just call it an even $300 million. And that's to operate all of his businesses, run his burn rate on all the money that he owes, and his families. And so it's a lot of money for you and me. But for Donald Trump, $300 million is sort of cutting it close in cash. But I'm sure that Don Hanky, who has real estate investments himself and is willing to be more creative in the type of assets he was willing to take, probably took something along the lines of, I'm just guessing here from my own experience, something along the lines of a stream of income that comes from assets that Donald Trump owns, lease payments, commercial rental payments, and other things that bonding companies usually don't want to take. I'm sure Don Hanky was like, we'll take it, because he wants to be in bed and in business with Donald Trump. And we have, for the first time in our entire political life for 270 years, a president who is for sale, a presidential candidate who is for sale, who's put himself up for the highest bidder, who's told the world that he's financially compromised, that's willing to sell bits of himself on an open market called NASDAQ with stock that has his initials on it. You want to buy a presidential candidate? You can. DJT is the stock initials. And here, every time he's in trouble or financially compromised, which means he's compromised from a national security standpoint. This is why you don't usually put somebody in a position of authority who's a bankrupt, who has credit problems, because they could succumb to bribery or become a foreign asset, right? This is the problem. And so Donald Trump needed the money at this point. He's on bended knee or bended something. And he got Don Henke, the king of the subprime mortgage, who only gives loans to people with no or low credit, sounds like a commercial, to give him the money. But there's something in return. There is a quid pro quo. We know what the quid is. We just don't know what the quo is yet, but we will. But it's just another example of Donald Trump having to auction himself off and get that bond posted. Now, what that means is that while the bond is in place, but there's a defect in it, while the bond is in place, and now that it is in place, Letitia James has to stop all of her collection activity on the $465 million judgment. Let me tell you what it doesn't mean, because I've seen it in the chat. It doesn't mean that interest is not still running on the full 465. It is. And it doesn't mean that somehow she has to just accept the $175 million if she wins and he defaults. It doesn't. It's just the undertaking or placeholder that the appellate court has allowed him to put in it to stop enforcement proceedings during the pendency of the appeal, which will be fully briefed over the summer with an oral argument in September. So that's what we had. But Karen, did you see that the bond that this company that doesn't do a lot of business in New York turned out to be defective? It has been bounced by the clerk's office.
Yeah, it seems like it's something that's easily remediable, but gee, what a kind of unforced error. It makes them look incompetent, frankly.
Yeah.
What do you make of it?
Yeah, they don't take, the New York doesn't take IOUs and pieces of paper that say that they are undertakings from companies they've never heard of, signed by presidents, this guy Amit Shah, who works for the company they've never heard of, without a financial statement, without a balance sheet. How ironic that Donald Trump used a bonding company that forgot to submit their personal financial statements for their company to show that they have the wherewithal to stand behind a $175 million bond. And surprise, New York clerk wasn't just accepting a piece of paper stamped by Knight Bonding Company and some guy they never heard of signing it and saying, okay, enforcement of the judgment is over now. We got a piece of paper that says it. There's errors in the judgment form, which will get fixed, as Karen, you just alluded to. And then they're going to have to submit their balance sheet and show that they are solvent as a bonding company. Yes, they have to be licensed in New York, but that doesn't mean that the clerk's office knows right now whether they actually are solvent and are good for the money. So this is going to be interesting. They'll give them some time and know to answer the questions I'm sure that will arise. It doesn't mean that in this short period of time while they fix this problem that Letitia James can go, sell Trump Tower. But it's got to get fixed. And then but it just shows you that he had to go out of state to California to some company nobody's ever heard of to go find a person like Trump who headed the company who just on a say-so, on a handshake, would allow him to take out $175 million of credit in a way that, as you always say, no normal average person would ever be able to do this. If you and I walked into, Don Henke's office and said, hi, I need $175 million judgment to post, bond to post in New York. And then you gave him the description of everything that went wrong in your financial life. I mean, how quickly would he be calling security to have you escorted out? But the reason that Donald Trump went to Henke is obvious, because any other legitimate, normal bonding company, and the ones that I've dealt with, are all backed usually by insurance, at that level, by insurance companies. And they are picky on who they do business with and the requirement for assets. And so he found this Don Henke guy to bail him out. But this is my posit, at what cost? At what price? How compromised is this candidate that he had to get it from him? And what is the policies that he will try to implement if he ever gets anywhere near the White House again as a result of having to do business on this bond? That's the issue for me, right, Karen?
Well, when it was originally, he had to give the full amount, right? The almost $500 million. His lawyers had to beg the appellate division, First Department, to please make that number lower because they were turned down by over 30 legitimate companies and banks and insurance companies, et cetera. They just couldn't get the bond. They couldn't get the money. And so the appellate division essentially bailed him out, lowered the amount to $175 million, but he still couldn't get a bond, even for that amount, from one of these illegitimate companies. He had to go to what's essentially a used car salesman. I mean, literally that's what this is. And it just really goes to show what a fraud Donald Trump is, right? He holds himself out as this billionaire business person, but he really, when it comes down to it, he has bankrupted more companies, right? Everything he's ever tried to do is bankrupted. And he doesn't have, as Alina Habba can go on TV and say that Donald Trump, maybe not every company, but a lot of his business ventures have gone bust, obviously. And Alina Habba, meanwhile, goes on and says, oh, he's a billionaire, he's rich, he's this, he's that, but he can't come up with cash and he can't get a loan from anybody. And that should tell you something, right? That should tell you something. So I just find the whole thing really suspect and also shady. And I just don't understand. How he continues to get away with it with his followers.
Yeah, because I agree with you. It's because they don't care. I did a hot take on how the Trump media stock is being propped up for a short time. So they can't do it unlimitedly because they're just too small. By his followers that are on, the 5 million active users on Trump media, Trump technology and media company, whatever it's called, which by the way is not that much higher than what the MeidasTouch network has. We're not publicly trading at whatever dollars on the stock exchange. But his people, I saw it, I don't know, you saw it in the New York Times, Karen. I know you did, you probably did, is that where they said that going to a Trump rally now is the equivalent of going to church. And I read that title and I was like, oh, I got to read this. And now he goes into his rallies and there's like a moment of hushed silence where he starts using biblical vocabulary and vernacular, and people in the audience bow their head like he's some sort of high priestess. And he talks about, in biblical terms, the battle for the soul of America, and that he's the one that's been chosen by God to fix it. And his people put their hand up like they're at some sort of, revival meeting. And it's scary to see. We joked on the network about the 59.99 Bible, but it's just this complete collapse of church and state. It goes beyond trying to use religion as a wedge issue, as a wedge cultural issue to drive a wedge between Americans to try to get elected. It's now, there were people in the audience, as reported in the New York Times, that told the reporter that they thought, hope people are sitting down for this one, that Donald Trump is more crucified than Jesus Christ. And this is where this kind of cult following for Donald Trump is right now. And to be clear, I have no issues with, prior to Trump, the Republicans as a party or as people or as fellow Americans. I may disagree with their policy decisions. I may not have agreed with all the planks of the presidential platform, but ultimately I could recognize them as another party, one of two in our country that were trying to govern and try to set policy. I don't recognize what's happening now by the MAGA takeover of this Republican Party. I mean, I feel like I'm living in the 1800s, and when there were like these multiple parties and there were takeovers of parties, and what was once the Whigs is now it's just a complete co-opting of what was once a legitimate party in this country under our constitutional system, and has now just been co-opted by evangelical Christians and others who see Donald Trump as their Lord and Savior.
But what I don't understand is, if you're an evangelical Christian and a Bible-fearing good person, and there are so many in this country, how you can back and support a rapist, somebody who brags about touching women in their private parts, somebody who's cheating on his wife with a porn star, somebody who, he doesn't live an upstanding Christian life. He doesn't live a life that should be in any way celebrated or revered. And that's what I don't understand, how he's co-opted, how he's been able to get, people that I know and love very much and I respect very much, close friends, close family members who have values and morals. I don't understand how he's been able to convince them that he's somebody worth following at this level. It's just really,
because on the fundamental, I agree with you, but on the fundamental things that move and animate them, on policy, on abortion, which we'll talk about in a bit, on religion in school, on other things that where they see the world through their biblical lens, he's on the right side of those issues for them in a way they think the Democrats aren't. And the solicitation of the evangelical right, the Christian right, has been going on and successfully by the Republican Party, since Lee Atwater, Karl Rove, all the way down to today. And it is a problem for the Democrats because if we can't, as a party, just to speak off of topic for a moment, but at the intersection of law and politics, if we can't make our tent large enough, and we do, but get the message out that they are welcome, of course, as fellow Americans in our party, it will make it more difficult than it needs to be every election cycle for us to win the presidency. Just will.
Yeah, look, it's just so complicated. There was a time in my life where I would have described myself as purple, right? There's some, I think we pay too much in taxes. I think, when it comes to certain, especially fiscal things, I think the government needs to be a little bit smaller, et cetera. Obviously, when it comes to social issues, I'm extremely liberal, but also when it comes to law enforcement, I still believe in the rule of law. I came up as a prosecutor. I am so not purple because I can't have anything to do with this Republican Party. I don't recognize it. I don't respect it. I don't value it. And I would have nothing to do with it. And I used to be someone who would say, I vote for the person, not the party. I would never say that right now. I will only vote Democrat 100%, even if I don't agree with everything they say, because the MAGA side of the Republican Party, which is essentially the whole Republican Party now, this is about our democracy. This isn't about, do you believe in this issue or that issue? This is about democracy. Donald Trump doesn't want to follow the rules, the law. He wanted to steal an election. Take it. It doesn't matter what people voted for or who they voted for or what they said. He wants to do and say whatever he wants. They want to basically, when the Supreme Court is going to look at history when it suits them and not look at history when it suits them, so that they can rule on things like abortion or whatever else they want, so that they can get the policies that they want. It doesn't matter what the law is. It doesn't matter what people vote for. This is what we're going to do. And I can't help but say it feels like, I remember, my grandparents, we've talked about this before, were Holocaust survivors. And I used to ask my dad, how did that happen? How did that happen? How is it possible that people followed Hitler? How could that have ever happened in this world? And you look at you look at people who are following Donald Trump, and I have to say, it scares me. I don't think we've come much further than that.
Well, there's an example of what we do every week, twice a week on the MeidasTouch Network on a show we call Legal AF. Join us on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and you'll find out why we called it that. We curate the top 5 developments at the intersection of law and politics, and we bring it to you just like that. You like lawyers talking about things, they know what they're talking about, then you've reached the right place on the dial, the MeidasTouch Network and Legal AF. So, if you know what I'm talking about and you like Legal AF and you've already seen the show, then take that clip, send it off to friends and family and say, hey, that show Legal AF I like a lot. Here's an example of it. Maybe they'll join our audience. If you have no idea what I'm talking about or who I am, I'm Michael Popok. That was Legal AF. And until my next hot take, until my next Legal AF episode, this is Michael Popok signing off. Heary, heary, Legal AF Law Breakdown is now in session. Go beyond the headlines and get a deep dive into the important legal concepts you need to know and we discuss every day on Legal AF. exclusive content you won't find anywhere else, all for the price of a couple of cups of coffee. Join us at patreon.com/legalaf. That's patreon.com/legalaf.